What in the skies is that thing? The scream burst from the radio of a Japanese Zero pilot in 1944, a voice cracked with fear and disbelief. At 30,000 feet, glistening in the sunlight, the shape appeared, too massive, too steady, too alien. It was no fragile B-17 or sluggish Liberator. This was something else. A fortress. A beast. A flying city. The B-29 Superfortress. From the ground, villagers craned their necks and shaded their eyes. What they saw was not the darting silhouette of the aircraft they had grown used to, but a silver leviathan drifting across the heavens. Its wings stretched wider than their streets. Its 4 roaring engines drummed so deeply that farmers swore they felt the earth trembling beneath their feet. Inside the cockpit of the Zero, oxygen ran thin as the pilot pushed his machine higher. Sweat froze against his cheekbones. He pulled at the stick, the engine groaned, and yet the distance between predator and prey never closed. The B-29 climbed like a mountain rising from the sea, untouchable, indifferent. Bullets spat from the Zero's guns, vanishing harmlessly in the void. Imagine yourself as that pilot. You had been taught that spirit and courage could overcome steel and numbers. You were told that Japan's skies were protected by discipline, by honor, by the sharp bite of your fighters' machine guns. But then you look up and you realize, none of that matters. The war has changed. The future has arrived, wrapped in silver skin and bristling with machine turrets, and you are powerless before it. The first sighting of the B-29 was not just a moment of combat. It was a revelation. For Japanese aviators, it was the instant when faith cracked, when the myths of invincibility shattered against the reality of American engineering. And in that instant, many knew, even if they would never admit it aloud, that defeat was inevitable. This is the story we are about to unravel. The story of how a single machine, born in secrecy and deployed with brutal clarity, turned the skies over Japan into a one-sided battlefield. We will walk through the diaries of pilots who wept behind oxygen masks, through the smoking ruins of cities turned into firestorms, through the strategic calculations that made the Superfortress not only a weapon of war but a symbol of inevitability. Stay with us because in the next chapters, you will see how the B-29 was not just an airplane. It was thunder given form, despair with wings. And for the men who looked up and whispered, "What in the skies is that thing?" It marked the beginning of the end. And if you want to journey deeper into these forgotten skies, through the machines, the men, and the myths that shaped the 20th century, then hit subscribe, join us on this channel, and let history unfold before your eyes. June 15, 1944. The humid night sky over Kyushu was restless, crisscrossed by the beams of searchlights and the muffled growl of distant engines. Japanese radar operators had reported something unusual, formations approaching from extraordinary distances, higher than anything they had tracked before. On their scopes, the blips moved with eerie steadiness. These were not the familiar B-24s or lumbering B-17s. Something else was coming. Something bigger. The target was Yota, Japan's proud steelworks, the beating heart of its war industry. For the Americans, the mission carried symbolic weight. If the arsenal of Nippon could be reached, nowhere was safe. If B-29s could strike from bases in China, then distance itself, the shield Japan had relied upon, was suddenly meaningless. For the Japanese defenders, the alarm was routine at first. Pilots scrambled into their Mitsubishi A6M0s and Ki-45 interceptors. Engines coughed to life on airstrips lined with bamboo. The men carried the same confidence that had sustained them since Pearl Harbor, the belief that skill and sacrifice outweighed material advantage. They had downed B-17s, shredded B-24s, harassed lumbering liberators across the Pacific. Why should tonight be any different? And then they saw it. A shape emerged against the stars, outlined by the faint glow of moonlight on aluminum skin. It was colossal, wings spreading wider than any they had seen, fuselage gleaming like a leviathan adrift in the heavens. At first, some pilots mistook it for several bombers flying in tight formation. Only as they closed the distance did the horrifying truth dawn. This was one aircraft, alone, dwarfing the hunters who circled it. The first Zero pilot who dove for attack felt his machine shudder as he climbed to reach the giant's altitude. His canopy frosted, his engine gasped in the thin air. He squeezed the trigger, tracers arcing upward. But before they could reach the bomber, red sparks of return fire stitched the night. The B-29's remote-controlled turrets, guided by gyroscopic sights and centralized fire control computers, had already locked on. The pilot yanked his stick, but too late. The Zero's wing tore apart under a hail of .50 caliber rounds. The fighter spiraled into darkness, a firefly snuffed out. Others tried with the same result. At 30,000 feet, oxygen-starved Japanese fighters faltered, engines sputtering in cold air never meant for their carburetors. Their bullets lacked reach, their cannons froze, and their pilots blacked out under the strain of forced climbs. Above them, the Superfortress cruised serenely, its pressurized cabin allowing American crews to breathe and fight as if in another world. From the ground, villagers near Yawata watched the spectacle. Searchlights lanced skyward, beams converging on silver titans that seemed immune to gravity. Anti-aircraft fire blossomed below them, bursts of orange that failed to touch their wings. For civilians accustomed to hearing that Japan's skies were secure, the sight was almost mystical, a harbinger of disaster. The raid itself was modest in damage. Industrial output at Yawata continued. But the symbolism was devastating. Here was proof, painted across the night, that Japan was no longer shielded by distance, nor by valor. For the first time, the war had breached the home islands, carried on the wings of machines that Japan had no answer for. The psychological blow fell hardest on the pilots. Diaries recovered after the war spoke of despair. One young aviator wrote, "They are like castles in the clouds. We chase but they do not care. It is like a child trying to strike the moon with a stick." Another scrawled bitterly, "Our generals say Spirit wins wars. Spirit freezes at 9,000 meters. Spirit cannot make my guns reach them." In those words lay the true invincibility of the B-29. Not merely in steel and fuel but in perception. The moment Japanese pilots realized they could not even touch their enemy, the myth of aerial supremacy cracked. Strategically, the Americans learned valuable lessons. The Yawata raid revealed logistical nightmares. Flying from Chinese bases strained supply lines with gasoline and bombs hauled over the Himalayas at great cost. Yet despite the inefficiency, the impact was undeniable. Even a raid with limited destruction forced Japan to confront an impossible reality. The enemy could strike anywhere, anytime with weapons far beyond the reach of interception. For the Japanese high command, this was a waking nightmare. Meetings in Tokyo rang with questions that had no answers. Should resources be diverted to build high-altitude interceptors? Should they focus on more anti-aircraft guns? Or should they lean further into desperation, kamikaze pilots, ramming attacks, suicide rockets? Every answer was a gamble, and every gamble looked feeble against the looming silver giants. Thus the legend began. The first sighting of the B-29 over Yawata was not remembered for its bombs but for its presence. The sound of its engines, deeper and steadier than anything before. The way it shrugged off pursuit. The hopeless tears of pilots who, for the first time, realized their courage had met something it could not overcome. And this was only the beginning. The raid on Yawata had been only a whisper of what was to come. By late 1944, the Americans had secured the Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. From these islands, B-29s no longer needed the perilous climb over the Himalayas. They could now launch in numbers that dwarfed the first tentative sorties from China. Japan, once thought untouchable, was now within daily reach of the Superfortress. The first major test of this new reality came over Nagoya in December 1944. For centuries, Nagoya had been a center of craftsmanship, and by the war years it had become the hub of Japan's aircraft industry. Mitsubishi factories there produced the Zero itself, the very fighter now scrambling desperately to defend the skies. On the morning of the raid, Zero pilots ascended with practiced discipline. They had studied American tactics, rehearsed attack runs, and been told by their commanders that even giants could bleed. But as they approached the formation, resolve faltered. The B-29s filled the sky in perfect geometrical boxes, gleaming phalanxes bristling with turrets. It was not like fighting an enemy, it was like confronting an airborne nation. A lieutenant in the 244th Sentai later recalled, "I climbed until my lungs burned. I saw their bellies open, bombs falling like a river of black stones. I fired until my guns clicked empty, but the monster did not burn. My comrades fell around me, cut apart by crossfire. I had no words, only tears." The bombs tore through Nagoya's industrial heart. The Mitsubishi plant was struck, production slowed, and for the first time Japan's military leaders realized that their lifeline of aircraft replacement could not be sustained. Yet what seared deeper than material loss was the impotence of defense. The Zeros that survived limped home, their ammunition spent, their pilots broken by what they had seen. Osaka's trial followed in March 1945, and it was worse. The city sprawled as one of Japan's largest industrial and commercial hubs. More than 300 B-29s descended upon it in coordinated waves. The sky itself seemed to darken under the density of silver wings. Anti-aircraft batteries barked furiously, but their shells burst below the bombers, black puffs in a sky that refused to yield. From the cockpit of a Kawasaki Ki-61 interceptor, Sergeant Major Takashi Ito described the scene in his journal. The fireballs rained endlessly. I rose into their path, but their guns found me before I found them. Holes opened in my wings. My plane shuddered like a dying animal. I dove away ashamed but alive. I wished I had died because living felt like cowardice. For Osaka's citizens, the experience was apocalyptic. Thousands of tons of incendiaries fell upon neighborhoods of wood and paper. Whole districts erupted into seas of fire. Mothers clutched children as rivers of flames surged through alleys. Survivors described the night as brighter than noon, the air thick with sparks that seared lungs and skin. When dawn came, entire wards were gone, obliterated not by a god's wrath, but by machines built on distant assembly lines in Kansas and Nebraska. By now, the Superfortress had acquired a new reputation, not just invincible but inevitable. The Japanese military could no longer predict where it would strike, only that it would. One day Nagoya, the next Kobe, then Tokyo. Its range erased geography. Its altitude erased interception. Its volume erased hope. Japanese tactics grew desperate. Ramming attacks were ordered. Young men were told to turn their fighters into human spears, to collide with the Titans and bring them down through sacrifice. A few succeeded. Here and there a B-29 spiraled from the sky, broken and burning. But for each fortress destroyed, dozens more filled the horizon. The arithmetic was merciless. For every life thrown away, American factories built another machine. Even among Japan's hardened officers, despair seeped in. General Masakazu Kawabe admitted in a confidential report, "Our anti-aircraft guns cannot reach them. Our fighters cannot climb to them. Our cities cannot withstand them. The enemy has produced a weapon against which we possess no answer." The invincibility was not flawless. Engines overheated, mechanical failures claimed lives, and some B-29s never returned from their missions. But for those on the receiving end, these losses were invisible. What they saw was endless. What they heard was eternal, the deep, relentless thunder of engines that never seemed to falter. Nagoya and Osaka became testaments to a new kind of warfare, industrial annihilation from a distance beyond retaliation. And for the pilots who tried and failed to touch the silver giants, the only memory was of futility. Tears frozen on their cheeks at 30,000 feet, curses lost in the thin air, prayers drowned by the roar of engines. This was not just war as they had known it. This was a new order, and the B-29 was its herald. March 9, 1945. The night air over Tokyo was cold, clear, and deceptively calm. Below, the city slept in fragile wooden houses packed shoulder to shoulder, unaware that within hours the capital would be transformed into a furnace. Above, on the horizon, came the steady growl, hundreds of engines, synchronized like a giant drumbeat. The B-29 Superfortress was about to write its darkest chapter. The plan was ruthless in its simplicity. General Curtis LeMay had abandoned the notion of precision bombing at high altitude. Japanese cities, he argued, were built of wood and paper, vulnerable not to explosive shock but to fire. So the B-29s would fly low at night, carrying not ordinary bombs but canisters of incendiaries. Instead of targeting factories or rail yards, they would burn the city itself. As the first formations crossed the coastline, Japanese radar operators sounded the alarm. Sirens wailed across Tokyo. Pilots scrambled into cockpits, but many hesitated. How could they face not dozens but hundreds of superfortresses? Those who took off soon realized the nightmare. The B-29s were flying lower than expected, but in such numbers that any approach meant charging through a storm of overlapping machine gun fire. At 1,500 meters, the sky lit up. Bomb bay doors yawned open, and the first wave of incendiaries cascaded downward. Magnesium and napalm ignited on impact, searing through rooftops, consuming tatami mats and sliding doors. Within minutes, entire blocks were ablaze. Flames merged into firestorms, sucking oxygen from the air, generating winds strong enough to topple walls. Civilians who fled found themselves pulled into vortexes of heat that charred them where they stood. A Japanese Zero pilot, Lieutenant Isamu Miyazawa, recorded his horror in a post-war interview. "I climbed above the city and looked down. The world was burning. Streets became rivers of fire. I thought of my family below. I could not stop crying even as I tried to dive at the bombers. My bullets disappeared into the darkness, and they did not even notice me." On the ground, chaos reigned. Fire brigades were helpless. Water hoses evaporated before reaching the flames. People crowded into rivers and canals, only to suffocate as firestorms consumed the air. By dawn, over 100,000 were dead, more than Hiroshima, more than Nagasaki. Tokyo had ceased to be a city and had become an open grave. For the Japanese pilots who survived the night, the despair was unbearable. They had watched the capital burn, unable to stop it. The B-29s had flown in, executed their mission, and returned with minimal losses. The psychological scar was permanent. One diary found among a fighter unit read, "We are birds with broken wings. We fly against a mountain of steel. Even our deaths cannot touch it." Technically, the Tokyo raid demonstrated the full versatility of the Superfortress. High altitude had once been its shield, but now it could descend and still dominate, its defensive turrets overlapping into impenetrable curtains. Its payload was unmatched, each aircraft carrying up to 7 tons of incendiaries. Its endurance was legendary, flying from the Marianas to Tokyo and back, covering distances Japanese fighters could never dream of. For American crews, the raid was both triumph and trauma. Some wrote in their logs of seeing fire visible from 150 miles away. Others spoke of the smell of smoke reaching into their cockpits. A navigator scribbled, "We did our duty, but God forgive us, the city is gone." Strategically, the firebombing broke Japan's spine. Production collapsed, morale disintegrated, and the myth of imperial protection evaporated. If the capital itself could vanish in a single night, what city was safe? And for the pilots of the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force, the sight of their homeland burning beneath the wings of untouchable fortresses was the death knell of their cause. In the weeks that followed, Tokyo was not alone. Kobe, Nagoya, and Yokohama suffered the same fate. Each raid reinforced the same brutal lesson: the B-29 could not be stopped. Where once the Zero had been a predator, now it was prey, flailing uselessly against leviathans that shrugged off their attacks. By spring 1945, despair was institutionalized. Commanders no longer spoke of victory, only of delaying the inevitable. Orders were issued for kamikaze intercepts, instructing pilots to ram their aircraft into B-29s. Some obeyed, achieving fleeting success, but even these suicidal acts barely dented the relentless tide. For every fortress destroyed, 10 more appeared on the horizon. The invincibility of the B-29 was thus not only technological but psychological. It broke the will of defenders before the bombs even fell. Japanese pilots took to the skies already mourning, already weeping behind their oxygen masks, knowing they faced an enemy that embodied inevitability. And still worse was to come. For the fire that consumed Tokyo was only a prelude to the unthinkable weapons the B-29 would soon deliver. August 6, 1945. The morning sky above Hiroshima was bright and clear, deceptively ordinary. Children walked to school, shopkeepers opened shutters, soldiers drilled in courtyards. Few bothered to look up when they heard the distant hum of engines. After all, they had grown used to the sound of B-29s. They were a constant presence, sometimes passing without dropping bombs, sometimes devastating entire cities. Civilians had learned to gamble with fate. But that day fate changed forever. The aircraft was called Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets. It looked no different from the hundreds of other silver giants that had haunted Japan's skies. Yet inside its bomb bay lay a weapon unlike anything the world had seen. A single device named Little Boy, capable of annihilation beyond comprehension. At 8:15 a.m., the bay doors opened. One bomb fell, tumbling silently toward the earth. Moments later, a sun was born over Hiroshima. A white flash blinded thousands. A shockwave flattened buildings for miles. Firestorms erupted instantly, consuming everything that still stood. Tens of thousands perished in seconds. Survivors stumbled through the ruins, their skin hanging in strips, their voices gone from screaming. The city itself seemed to dissolve into ash. For Japanese pilots stationed nearby, the horror was beyond belief. One diary later recovered read, "We thought one bomber could hurt a factory, maybe a neighborhood. We never thought one bomber could erase a world." The invincible fortress had become the harbinger of a new age, a messenger carrying apocalypse in its belly. 3 days later, on August 9, the nightmare repeated itself. The B-29 Boxcar, commanded by Major Charles Sweeney, carried a bomb far more powerful than the first, Fat Man. Its target was Kokura, but heavy smoke obscured the city. The bomber turned instead toward Nagasaki. At 11:02 a.m. the bomb fell, and within moments Nagasaki was a wasteland. Entire districts vanished. Survivors described a darkness filled not with smoke, but with silence, broken only by the cries of the dying. By now, Japanese air defenses were ghosts. Fighters barely rose to challenge the bombers, their pilots too few, too weary, too broken. Anti-aircraft batteries fired sporadically, more in ritual than in hope. The B-29s flew almost unopposed, gods in the sky, their silver skins glinting as if mocking the impotence below. The psychological collapse was total. For years, Japan had preached that spirit, Yamato Damashii, could overcome any obstacle. Yet against the superfortress, spirit had withered. Against nuclear fire, it evaporated. Generals who once thundered about honor now whispered of surrender. Civilians who once cheered their defenders now huddled in ruins, awaiting the next silver giant that might end their world. The emperor himself, in his surrender broadcast on August 15, spoke of a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable. What he did not need to say was understood by every citizen. The weapon had arrived on the wings of the B-29. For the pilots who had once challenged the invaders, the despair was personal. Lieutenant Hiroshi Arakawa, grounded after losing 2 comrades in failed interceptions, wrote in his final letter, "The sky belongs to them now. Our swords are made of paper. We cannot even scratch their fortress. I am ashamed, I am broken, but I am also relieved, for at last the struggle is over." The invincibility of the B-29 was thus proven not only in battle but in its ultimate mission, delivering the weapons that forced Japan to surrender. No fighter brought it down, no defense halted it, no courage overcame it. It dictated the terms of war from the stratosphere, and when it chose to descend, it ended civilizations in a single flash. In hindsight, the despair of Japanese pilots was inevitable. The B-29 was decades ahead of anything they could field. It flew higher, faster, farther, and carried more destruction than any machine before it. It was not merely a bomber, it was a symbol of industrial dominance, of a nation that could turn factories into thunderclouds. For the men who looked up and whispered in horror, there was no comfort, no answer. Only tears. And thus the story closed. From Yoda's steelworks to Tokyo's firestorms, from Hiroshima's blinding sun to Nagasaki's silence, the B-29 carved its legend into history. It was invincible not because it was flawless, but because it changed the very meaning of war. And for the Japanese pilots who cried out upon seeing it for the first time, that despair was not weakness, it was prophecy. When the B-29 first appeared in the skies above Japan in 1944, it did not merely introduce a new weapon, it revealed the deep fractures within Japan's war effort. To understand why the Superfortress inspired such despair among Japanese pilots, one must step back into the context of a nation stretched beyond endurance, clinging to outdated doctrine while facing an enemy whose industrial might had outstripped imagination. Japan had entered the war intoxicated by early victories. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies had fallen in rapid succession. The Zero fighter, with its unmatched maneuverability, symbolized an empire at its zenith. But by 1943, the tide had shifted. The United States, with its vast industrial heartland, began producing aircraft at a rate Japan could not hope to match. Factories in Detroit, Seattle, and Wichita turned out bombers and fighters by the thousands. Japan's own plants, constrained by raw material shortages and hampered by Allied submarine blockades, struggled to keep pace. This imbalance set the stage for the arrival of the B-29. While Japan's cities remained mostly untouched in the early war years, its leaders knew the day would come when the homeland itself became a target. They had believed, however, that distance would shield them. American bombers could not reach Tokyo, they thought. The Pacific was too vast, the logistical challenge insurmountable. The Superfortress shattered that illusion in a single night raid on Yoda. The issue was not only material but philosophical. Japanese military doctrine had long emphasized spirit over technology. Pilots were taught that courage and skill could overcome mechanical disadvantage. This ethos worked in 1941, when the Zero faced clumsier opponents. But by 1944 that doctrine had become a trap. Against the B-29, courage meant little. A Zero could not climb as high, could not endure the cold, could not survive the crossfire of multiple turrets coordinated by an advanced fire control system. The tears of pilots who failed to touch the giants were not weakness, they were the recognition of doctrine colliding with reality. On the ground, civilians were caught in the middle of this transformation. The Japanese government continued to promise protection, broadcasting messages that the divine wind of Japan's defenders would repel invaders. But the sight of B-29s cruising overhead, unchallenged, told a different story. Rumors spread quickly that the bombers were immune to bullets, that they carried weapons capable of wiping out entire districts. In villages, children drew crude sketches of the silver planes, labeling them death birds. Fear became part of daily life. The political leadership faced dilemmas with no good answers. Some argued for developing new interceptors, the Ki-84H-8, the Ki-100, or jet projects inspired by Germany's Me-262. But production bottlenecks and fuel shortages doomed these programs before they could make an impact. Others pushed for mass deployment of suicide tactics. Pilots ordered to ram their planes into B-29 formations. A handful of these attacks succeeded, but each victory cost a precious life for negligible gain. The math was merciless. One dead pilot for one damaged bomber, while American factories replaced their losses within weeks. Anti-aircraft defenses offered little solace. Japan's guns lacked the altitude reach and radar precision of their German counterparts. Ammunition was scarce. Batteries that fired at night did so blindly, often wasting shells. Villagers mocked the futility of bamboo spears against dragons, a phrase that captured the absurdity of expecting outdated weapons to repel modern steel. Meanwhile, the Americans exploited Japan's vulnerabilities with ruthless efficiency. Curtis LeMay's shift to low-altitude incendiary raids was not born of mercy but of cold calculation. Japan's wooden cities burned too easily, and the firestorms that resulted consumed not only homes but morale. Each raid deepened the sense of helplessness among both civilians and military alike. Pilots could no longer believe in the invincibility of their skies. Citizens could no longer believe in the invincibility of their empire. At the core of this despair lay a larger truth. The war was no longer a contest of warriors but of industries. The B-29 was not just an aircraft, it was a flying factory output, the embodiment of America's ability to mobilize science, technology, and mass production. For every Zero Japan built, America built 10 Hellcats. For every factory bombed in Nagoya, another rose in Wichita to churn out more superfortresses. Spirit could not close that gap. In this context, the B-29 was more than a weapon. It was a mirror held up to Japan's weaknesses. Each time a pilot climbed into the thin air and failed to reach the leviathans above, he confronted not just an enemy but the futility of his nation's strategy. Each time civilians watched silver wings pass overhead, they saw the inevitability of defeat. Thus the despair was not born in a single moment but in a series of realizations. That courage alone could not reach the stratosphere, that factories alone could not build enough machines, that prayers alone could not stop the firestorms. The B-29, in its invincibility, exposed the fragility of an empire built on belief rather than balance. And so, when pilots wept at the sight of the Superfortress, they were not simply lamenting the loss of comrades or cities. They were mourning the collapse of a worldview. The age of spirit had ended. The age of steel, fuel, and machines had taken its place. The B-29 Superfortress owed its aura of invincibility to engineering choices that made it a machine decades ahead of its time, and the first of these was altitude. Whereas a Mitsubishi A6M0 began to gasp for breath above 9,000 meters, its carbureted engine choking on thin air, the B-29 could loiter serenely at more than 30,000 feet, its turbo-supercharged Wright R-3350 engines delivering steady power in conditions where Japanese aircraft staggered like men climbing without oxygen. Pilots in Zeros or Ki-61s who tried to climb found their cockpits frosting over, their guns freezing and their own bodies starved of breath, while inside the Superfortress American crews sat in heated, pressurized compartments breathing comfortably as if in a passenger liner. This alone created a psychological gulf. One side struggled simply to reach the fight, the other flew as though gravity had been suspended. Speed was the next cruel disparity. A Zero might dive to nearly 530 kilometers per hour, but its cruising speed was far less, and at high altitude its engine faltered. The B-29, by contrast, could cruise at over 350 miles per hour even when heavily loaded, matching or exceeding the performance of fighters that were supposed to be interceptors. A Japanese pilot once wrote bitterly that by the time he clawed his way high enough to fire, the Fortress had already slipped past, like a whale moving while we flapped like sparrows. Range widened the gap further. Japan's fighters were designed for tactical battles close to bases. The Zero's combat radius was impressive for 1941, about 1,500 kilometers, but it was still a local defender. The B-29, however, was a transoceanic predator, capable of flying nearly 6,000 kilometers on a single mission, striking from the Marianas and returning with fuel to spare. For Japanese strategists, this destroyed the illusion of distance as a shield. The Pacific, once thought a protective moat, became instead a highway for leviathans of steel. Firepower made the disparity in altitude and range even more terrifying. Japanese interceptors carried two 7.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannons at best, weapons designed to shred nimble bombers like the B-17 if they could close the distance. But closing that distance against a B-29 was nearly suicidal. Its skin bristled with 10.50 caliber Browning machine guns arranged in remote-controlled turrets, each directed by an analog computer that calculated deflection angles and converging fire with uncanny precision. For Japanese pilots accustomed to dueling with single gunners in tail positions, diving at a B-29 was like charging into a wall of invisible fire. Those who survived described the experience as watching tracers stitch the night long before their own guns were in range, their cockpits rattling with impacts before they could line up a shot. In a cruel irony, the Fortress carried more defensive weapons than the aircraft attacking it. Payload completed the picture of invincibility. A Zero could carry a few bombs when converted for ground attack, perhaps 500 kilograms at most, and even larger twin-engine bombers of Japan struggled to haul more than a ton. The B-29, by comparison, could deliver over 9,000 kilograms of bombs on a single mission, nearly 20 times the load of the fighters chasing it. Put plainly, one Superfortress could deliver the destructive power of an entire Japanese squadron, and it could do so with greater range at higher altitude, and while defending itself better than the attackers. The contrast was not just technical, it was existential. This is why when we line up the numbers, the despair becomes self-explanatory. The B-29's maximum speed of roughly 575 km per hour overshadowed the Zero's 533. Its operational ceiling of nearly 10 kilometers rendered Japanese fighters impotent at their own service limits of 6 to 7 kilometers. Its bomb load exceeded 9 tons where Japanese interceptors carried nothing comparable. These were not just figures on a page, they were barriers pilots felt in their bones when their engines sputtered, their fingers froze on triggers that could not reach, and their comrades fell in flames before even touching the enemy. What made the comparison more brutal was that the Americans did not field the B-29 in handfuls. They built nearly 4,000 of them, each one a fortress in its own right, whereas Japan struggled to keep pace with losses in its fighter squadrons. For every Zero shot down, replacement lagged. For every B-29 destroyed, another rolled out of Boeing's factories in Wichita. The machine was not just a bomber but an expression of industrial inevitability. Thus, when Japanese pilots cried out upon first sighting the Superfortress, they were not reacting only to the silver gleam of an unfamiliar silhouette. They were responding to physics, to numbers, to the cruel realization that courage could not close the gulf between what their hands gripped and what loomed above them. The fortress flew higher than they could reach, faster than they could chase, struck harder than they could endure, and defended itself with weapons deadlier than anything they carried. To attack it was not a duel. It was suicide measured in statistics. If altitude, speed, and firepower established the B-29's dominance, then its systems, the hidden machinery inside, cemented its reputation as an invincible fortress. Japanese pilots did not merely confront a bigger bomber, they faced a machine that redefined how air war was fought. The heart of this lay in its engines. The Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclones, each a 2,200 horsepower monster fitted with turbosuperchargers that maintained power even in the thin air of the stratosphere. To a Japanese pilot accustomed to coaxing performance out of smaller radial engines that faltered above 6 kilometers, the roar of the R-3350 was a sound of despair, a reminder that his own machine belonged to an earlier era. These engines were temperamental, prone to overheating and even catastrophic fires, but when they worked, they elevated the bomber into a class beyond interception. Even more disorienting for Japanese attackers was the defensive system. Unlike the B-17, where gunners sat in individual turrets and aimed manually, the B-29 employed a centralized fire control computer that linked turrets together. A single gunner could control multiple stations, the analog computing sites predicting the path of attacking fighters and directing streams of .50 caliber fire with terrifying precision. Japanese pilots who attempted frontal or tail approaches, the classic tactics used successfully against earlier bombers, found themselves shredded long before they could bring their own guns to bear. In combat reports, phrases recur again and again: approach impossible, fire too dense, attacks scattered. To them, the fortress seemed to see in every direction, as if it were a living creature bristling with reflexes. Bombing capacity was another gulf that widened despair. A Zero, if pressed into ground attack, could carry perhaps half a ton of bombs. Even larger Japanese twin-engine bombers rarely exceeded a single ton of ordnance. But the B-29 carried up to 9 tons, distributed in 2 massive bomb bays. This meant that one superfortress, flying unescorted, could devastate industrial districts that would have required entire waves of Japanese aircraft. When hundreds flew together, the arithmetic turned catastrophic. Cities like Nagoya, Kobe, and Tokyo discovered this when block after block dissolved under torrents of incendiaries. From the cockpit of a fighter, a pilot knew that even if by some miracle he downed one bomber, dozens more would still release their loads, and the city beneath would burn regardless. The futility of interception was thus not theoretical but lived. Bravery equaled irrelevance. The contrast between B-29 and Japanese interceptors can be understood best when their characteristics are laid side by side, though not in sterile tables but in the context of combat. Imagine a Ki-61 Tony climbing at full throttle, its liquid-cooled engine straining to 580 km per hour in a dive, service ceiling at just over 11,000 meters but with pilots often blacking out long before reaching such altitude. Now imagine the B-29, cruising steadily at 9,000 meters with 4 engines maintaining speed close to 600 km per hour. In theory the Tony could reach it. In practice the climb consumed fuel, the guns froze in the cold, and the pilot arrived exhausted. He had 2 12.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. The fortress replied with 10 heavy Brownings, each stabilized by computing sites. The outcome was predictable, and Japanese pilots wrote afterward of shooting at a wall that shot back. Range compounded the sense of helplessness. Japan's fighters were chained to their bases, limited to combat radii of around 500 kilometers. They could defend Tokyo, perhaps Osaka, but they could not hunt the B-29s at sea, nor could they shadow them across the long approach routes from the Marianas. The fortress came and went at will. Crews in Guam or Tinian planned raids like logistical exercises, their fuel and payload calculated by engineers, while Japanese defenders waited blindly, unable to predict when or where the hammer would fall. It was like fighting a storm. One could brace but one could not prevent. The sophistication extended beyond flight performance. The B-29 structure itself was an innovation, a sleek fuselage of stressed aluminum skin that reduced weight while increasing strength. The pressurization system allowed long missions without exhausting the crew, something Japanese aviators envied bitterly as they shivered in unheated cockpits. Electrical systems linked turrets, lights, and instruments, making the interior of the bomber resemble more a flying laboratory than a war machine. For Japanese crews who managed to inspect wreckage, the impression was almost mystical. One intelligence officer noted in 1945, "It is not merely an airplane. It is an industry with wings." And this was the essence of despair. The realization that the B-29 represented not only a technological leap but also an industrial chasm. Japan could conceive of high-performance fighters. The Ki-84 Hay-8 was proof, with speed and armament that could in theory threaten a B-29. But production numbers lagged, fuel shortages crippled deployment, and maintenance standards fell as the war dragged on. America, by contrast, produced thousands of B-29s, each one requiring the work of tens of thousands of laborers, millions of parts, and vast supply chains. For every Japanese attempt to innovate, the Americans answered with overwhelming quantity. Some Japanese officers speculated in private about what might have changed had the Me-262 jet, developed by Germany, been shared sooner or produced domestically. In theory, a jet fighter with its blazing speed could slash through B-29 formations. But such speculation was fantasy. Japan lacked the fuel, the materials, and the time. Even if a jet brought down one or two fortresses, dozens more would still carry out their mission. The despair did not come from the belief that the fortress was invulnerable to bullets. It came from the recognition that no system Japan possessed could alter the strategic balance. Thus, the technical edge of the B-29 was not an isolated marvel but a constellation of advances woven into one machine. Pressurized cabins that allowed the stratosphere to become home, turbo-supercharged engines that roared where others wheezed, fire control computers that turned gunners into snipers, bomb bays that disgorged destruction by the ton, and range that rendered oceans meaningless. Japanese pilots who gazed upon its silhouette were not wrong to cry out in disbelief. They were witnessing the arrival of an aircraft that belonged not to their war, but to the wars of the future. The despair of Japanese pilots did not arise merely from technical inferiority, it was born of comparison, of realizing in the middle of combat that the very assumptions underpinning Japan's war effort were wrong. When one sets the B-29 Superfortress against the aircraft and doctrines of Japan, the contrast is stark, not just in numbers but in philosophy. From the outset, Japanese aviation was built around agility and spirit. The Mitsubishi A6M0, the pride of the Imperial Navy in 1941, embodied this belief. Light, nimble, and long-ranged, it dominated in dogfights against early Allied aircraft. But by 1944, its design philosophy was a liability. To achieve that agility, engineers had sacrificed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. Against a B-29, this meant suicide. A single hit from a turret could turn a zero into a torch, while the bomber itself absorbed multiple cannon strikes and kept flying. The very attributes once celebrated, lightness, maneuverability, and faith in pilot skill, were irrelevant in the high-altitude duels against the fortress. The Ki-61 Tony, and later the Ki-84 Hay-8, tried to bridge the gap. Faster, heavier, better armed, they offered hope on paper. In practice, shortages of high-octane fuel crippled performance, while poor maintenance led to constant mechanical failures. Japanese pilots often scrambled in aircraft that could not reach their advertised ceilings, their engines coughing before they ever sighted a fortress. By contrast, American B-29s were supported by a global supply chain, their fuel refined to high standards, their maintenance rigorous. This disparity was not about pilot bravery but about logistics. Strategically, the Japanese command committed a fatal miscalculation by underestimating the pace of American innovation. In 1942, when Japanese planners assessed American industry, they mocked its supposed weakness, believing that cultural superiority and fighting spirit would offset material inferiority. Yet by 1944, Boeing's factories in Wichita and Renton were turning out machines whose capabilities Japan could not even replicate in prototype form. The B-29's pressurization system, for instance, used technology so advanced that Japanese engineers examining wreckage were stunned. One report stated bluntly, "We lack both the materials and the instruments to reproduce this." Another critical error lay in the allocation of resources. Even as B-29s burned cities, Japanese industry continued diverting labor into building ships and tanks that would never leave port or garage. Fighter programs were fragmented, with dozens of experimental designs consuming precious resources but producing few combat-ready squadrons. When desperation finally drove leaders to embrace kamikaze tactics, they were applying the same flawed doctrine that had guided the Zero, that spirit alone could bridge the gap. Ramming attacks did bring down a handful of fortresses, but the arithmetic remained merciless. For every B-29 lost, 10 more loomed on the horizon. The contrast also extended to doctrine. American commanders like Curtis LeMay abandoned traditional precision bombing when it failed, embracing mass incendiary raids that exploited Japan's vulnerability. Japanese commanders, by contrast, clung to outdated faith in honor and individual valor. Even when evidence mounted that interceptions were failing, reports to Tokyo were often softened, blaming weather or lack of coordination, rather than admitting that the fortress was effectively untouchable. This denial delayed any coherent strategy. By the time serious proposals for high-altitude interceptors and jet fighters emerged, the war was already lost. Numbers illustrate the futility. A formation of 300 B-29s, each carrying 6 to 7 tons of bombs, could drop nearly 2,000 tons in a single night. To stop even half of them, Japan would have needed thousands of sorties by interceptors, each burning scarce fuel and each vulnerable to overwhelming defensive fire. In reality, defending squadrons numbered in the dozens, not thousands. Pilots faced odds so hopeless that survival became more miraculous than victory. One Japanese general later admitted in post-war interrogation, "We prepared for battle against enemies of our own scale. We did not prepare for war against a factory." This summed up the greatest mistake, treating the United States as a rival nation rather than as a continental industrial machine. The B-29 was the ultimate expression of that machine, a bomber whose design incorporated not just technology but the weight of an entire economy. In hindsight, the comparison seems cruel. The B-29 was not a fair opponent for the Zero or the He-8, it was a weapon of another age. Yet war does not wait for fairness. Japan's failure to anticipate such a leap, its reliance on spirit over substance, and its inability to adapt once reality struck, all sealed its fate. The cries of pilots, echoing in the thin air as they dove helplessly at fortresses they could not reach, were not just the sounds of defeat. They were the sound of doctrine collapsing, of a nation's strategy unraveling in real time. The lesson is clear. Courage can inspire, but courage without capability is tragedy. In the skies above Japan, the B-29 made that truth undeniable. When the B-29 Superfortress appeared in Japan's skies, its immediate impact was destruction. Cities burning, factories collapsing, civilians fleeing through infernos. Yet its longer legacy reached deeper than physical ruin. The Superfortress reshaped Japanese psychology, dismantled military doctrine, and altered the trajectory of world history. The despair of pilots who wept behind oxygen masks was only the most visible symptom of a broader collapse, a recognition that technology and industry had remade the rules of war. For civilians, the B-29's raids redefined terror. Earlier in the war, bombings had been sporadic, often localized to military targets. By 1945, raids by hundreds of fortresses created firestorms that consumed entire neighborhoods. In Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya, families saw their homes vanish in nights of fire so intense that rivers boiled and stone bridges cracked. Survivors remembered the sound of engines as an omen. The low, steady roar of the B-29s meant not merely bombs but apocalypse. A woman from Tokyo later said, "When I hear aircraft even today, I feel my chest tighten." The silver planes were not machines, they were monsters in the sky. Such testimonies reveal that the fortress became not just a weapon but a symbol of inevitability, a shadow hanging over daily life. For the Japanese military, the B-29 exposed the hollowness of doctrine built on spirit and sacrifice. Pilots trained to believe that courage could overcome steel found themselves powerless. Anti-aircraft crews who fired into the night and saw their shells burst far below the fortresses realized they were participating in ritual, not defense. Commanders, unwilling to admit helplessness, demanded ramming tactics and kamikaze missions. These orders sacrificed lives for negligible gains, reinforcing despair rather than inspiring resistance. Each failed interception eroded faith not only in weapons but in leadership. The fortress thus corroded morale from the skies downward, stripping away the belief that Japan could dictate its own fate. Politically, the B-29 accelerated the end of the war. By mid-1945, Japan's leaders faced a choice: surrender or see every city annihilated. The firebombing of Tokyo, which killed more than 100,000 in a single night, broke the illusion that the home islands were invulnerable. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, destroyed by atomic bombs delivered by B-29s, closed the debate. The emperor himself admitted in his surrender broadcast that the power of this new weapon was incalculable. Yet it was not only the atomic blast that forced surrender, it was the credibility of the bomber that carried it. The Japanese knew the Americans could deliver these bombs again and again, anywhere, anytime. The Superfortress had turned surrender from dishonor into survival. Globally, the B-29 signaled a transformation in warfare. Its combination of altitude, range, payload, and advanced systems foreshadowed the Cold War's strategic bombers, the B-36, B-47, and B-52. It was the first aircraft to make intercontinental war practical, erasing oceans as barriers. Military theorists worldwide recognized that defense against such machines required new approaches: radar-guided missiles, jet interceptors, and eventually nuclear deterrence. The despair of Japanese pilots was, in effect, the first glimpse of an age when national survival depended not on bravery in dogfights but on the balance of technological terror. The psychological impact extended even to the victors. American crews, though triumphant, carried memories of devastation that haunted them. Navigators wrote of cities burning so brightly they could see them from 100 miles away. Gunners confessed that watching civilians run through firestorms left them numb. One pilot recalled, "We won, but we left behind a smell I will never forget." The fortress had given them invulnerability, but at the cost of carrying out missions that blurred the line between military necessity and annihilation. This burden shaped post-war debates about morality and air power, debates that continue today. For Japan's post-war society, the memory of the B-29 became part of its identity. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, museums preserve fragments of the bomber's missions, reminding visitors that the end of one era was carried on the wings of these machines. Survivors passed down stories of the sound of engines, of the silver glint in the sky, of the helplessness of watching bombs fall without resistance. These memories became warnings, shaping Japan's post-war pacifism and its constitutional renunciation of war. The fortress thus left a legacy not only in ruins but in the national psyche, embedding caution against militarism. In strategic hindsight, the invincibility of the B-29 was not absolute. Its engines failed often, it suffered losses to flak and interceptors, and many missions returned with fewer aircraft than they launched. Yet perception mattered more than statistics. To Japanese defenders, each fortress appeared eternal, each formation infinite. This perception created a psychological collapse that multiplied the bomber's effect beyond its tonnage of explosives. Wars are fought not only with steel and fuel but with belief, and the B-29 destroyed belief as effectively as it destroyed factories. Its long-term influence stretched into the Cold War nuclear standoff. The doctrine of deterrence, the idea that a bomber force could guarantee retaliation and thus prevent attack, was born in the shadow of the Superfortress. The fear Japanese pilots felt when they whispered, "What is that thing?" was a preview of the fear nations would feel staring at fleets of B-52s or squadrons of nuclear-armed jets decades later. The fortress had redefined war as not just a clash of armies but as a contest of survival between industrialized societies armed with weapons of annihilation. In the end, the B-29 was not invincible because it was flawless. It was invincible because it represented a new paradigm. It embodied the reality that wars in the modern age were decided not by duels of warriors but by systems of production, by science and technology applied at scale. Japanese pilots cried in despair not because they were cowards but because they saw the truth. The fortress showed them, with every mission, that bravery had reached its limit, and the future belonged to machines that turned nations into shadows on maps. The cry of despair that burst from Japanese radios upon first sighting the B-29 Superfortress was more than a reaction to a machine, it was the sound of a world ending. In that moment, pilots who had been trained to believe in the supremacy of spirit and skill confronted a reality their commanders had long denied. The war was no longer decided by valor in the cockpit. It was decided by industry, by science, by a fortress of aluminum and fire that made oceans irrelevant and courage obsolete. The lesson is timeless. The B-29 revealed that clinging to outdated doctrine, no matter how heroic, leads only to tragedy. Japan's belief in spiritual superiority could not shield its cities from firestorms, nor could it stop the atomic suns that blossomed over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By contrast, America's investment in research, logistics, and production created an aircraft so advanced that it seemed to belong to another era. The cries of pilots were therefore not shameful. They were prophetic, announcing the dawn of a world where survival depended on adaptation, not tradition. As a machine, the B-29 was imperfect. Engines overheated, mechanical failures grounded flights, missions failed. But as a symbol, it was flawless. It stood for inevitability, for the crushing weight of industrial war. It proved that technology could shatter faith, that one machine could change not just battles but the destiny of nations. That is why its legacy endures, not only in museums and textbooks but in the very foundations of modern strategy, from nuclear deterrence to long-range precision strikes. For us today, the Superfortress is a reminder of humility. It shows that no nation, however proud, can ignore the march of progress. It warns that hubris is brittle when confronted with innovation. And it whispers across the decades that despair in the face of change can either break you or teach you. Japan wept, but the world learned. So as we close this story, remember the image: a Japanese pilot climbing desperately toward a silver shape in the sky, oxygen thin, guns frozen, tears running unseen behind his mask. He cries out, not in cowardice but in recognition, that the future has arrived and he cannot touch it. That cry still echoes, telling us that history belongs not to those who resist change, but to those who embrace it. If you found this journey through forgotten skies compelling, if you want to explore more about the machines, the men, and the myths that defined our modern world, then stay with us. Subscribe, share this story, and keep flying with us into the past, where every shadow in the sky carried a lesson, and every lesson still matters today.